Well, let's start with this book, Unceded. Now, what an incredible, incredible book. George, please tell me, what inspired this book for you and to write it?
Well, the story really, and first of all, thank you for the honor of being with you tonight, and thank you all for coming out and hearing a little bit about Unceded. Really appreciate you doing that. It's an honor to have you here. So the story on Unceded goes back to the period when I was Minister of Indigenous Relations in British Columbia. I had the honor of extending to the Seke Dene people who live on the north end of the Williston Reservoir. The Williston Reservoir created by the W.A.C. Bennett Dam. The Seke Dene people were flooded out. Virtually all of their traditional territory was flooded by the waters of Williston Reservoir back in the mid-1960s. And it took over 20 years for the province to even recognize the harm that they had done and to create a replacement reserve for them and to provide some compensation. But the issue carried on right up until 2010, to the time when I was minister, when a final agreement was reached between the Seke Dene, the province, and BC Hydro. So my role was to go up and to extend an apology on behalf of the people of British Columbia to the Seke Dene for the harms that had been inflicted on them over a more than 20-year period. And, you know, so I was really shocked by all the briefing materials that my ministry provided to me with respect to the Seke Dene experience. And so I thought to myself, so I would have been a boy at the time when the initial flooding and the harms occurred. And it shocked me that something as egregious as that event could have occurred at a time when I was a young British Columbian. So after I left politics in 2013, I started a doctoral studies in political science at the University of Victoria. One of my profs was kind enough, I had this idea about doing an article for BC Studies on the experience not only of the Seke Dene, but also the experience of the Chislata, who had been flooded out by the Elcan project a decade earlier. And both of them I thought were just really staggering stories. So I did that article, I did a fair bit of archival research, and then I thought, there's clearly a broader story here. It wasn't just in the 1960s and 1970s that the province started to have these kind of approaches to Indigenous issues. It was clearly a much longer. So I started digging into the archives. My daughter at the time lived 2 blocks from the Federal Archives, so it was kind of handy. I spent a lot of time there, and it's testament to how empty my life is that I love spending time in archives. And so spent a lot of hours there, spent a lot of time at the provincial archives, and this sort of amazing story started to come up. And so that's really the genesis of the story was that experience. And it wasn't an easy apology to deliver. It was difficult not to tear up, to be frank. But we did it. And I think the Seke Dene appreciated that at last they did get an apology for all the harms that had been done to them.
That's incredible. Thank you, George, for all your contribution to raising awareness and speaking out on the injustice for Indigenous people in this province and indeed this country. I too come from a very proud political legacy. I am the daughter of the late Fred House, and my grandmother co-founded the very first movement for the Métis and the non-status Indians here in BC called Mackenzie back in 1969. My dad became the president in 1970, and as a little girl, I watched my dad on TV growing up, so Now I'm on TV myself, so you can understand the connection there. There's such a strong lineage between the past and the future and where we're going. As a video journalist, I travel all over the place telling incredible stories, but George, you've really nailed it in this book.
Thank you.
Let me just start by first of all, referring to the prologue here, because I think it's very, very powerful and certainly speaks to what we're all here this evening for. In 1887, Nisga'a chiefs launched a 15-meter cedar canoe into the Nass River in northwest British Columbia and paddled south toward Victoria, determined to secure a treaty recognizing their land rights. Weeks later, they completed their epic journey of over 500 nautical miles, 900 kilometers, to Victoria's inner harbor, only to be barred from the legislature by the Premier, William Smythe. He reluctantly agreed to meet the delegation, but only outside the legislative precinct, and dismissed their land aspirations with condescension and contempt. I mean, to hear those words, to read those words, and to feel what the nation must have gone through, and indeed all Indigenous people around the world are really fighting the same fight. George, how has this affected you personally to read such injustice in your research and now to put this out in your book?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think the thing that really impressed me most as I was working through volumes and volumes of archival material was that the quotes, the direct quotes from the participants, whether it's William Smythe's quote there, I spent a couple of chapters on the McKenna-McBride Commission of 1912 to 1916. The commission toured the province. They met with town councils, they met with chambers of commerce, but they also met with Indigenous people. And some of the testimony that was heard there, to this day, it haunts me. And you don't really appreciate the character of the injustice that was perpetrated across, at least 120 years, and really it continues today to some extent. But just to hear the direct quotes from the time is so powerful. And I obviously wasn't able to get every quote I wanted to in the book, but I like to see history brought alive by the words coming out of the mouths of the people involved. It's way more powerful than me trying to sort of simplify it and deliver it that way. So as much as I can, I try to have the voices of those involved directly spoken.
Well, it's very clearly written on these pages that you've been able to put together in this incredible book of yours. I think I asked you this earlier as we were sitting in the green room, but you must have came across so much research that I'm sure there's more books for you in the future.
Well, you never know. This is my second book. I did a book called Big Promises, Small Government, which was a look at the government that I was a part of from 2001 to 2005. I was a social minister in that government, and it's all about tax cuts and the impact that had on social programs. It's not a happy book, that one, I must say, but it's an interesting book, and again, testament to my empty life. I love research. I love writing, so I may well do it again. But who knows? It might be healthcare next time. The 4 years as a health minister permanently scarred me. I aged about 28 years, I think it was, over those 4 years. So I'm only 28 today. I know I look a little bit older than that, and that's because of being health minister. So, but there's some great stories there too. So I might well do that, and maybe another book in this area too. It's been a huge honor to recently be appointed to the BC Treaty Commission by the BC government. It's a fascinating a fascinating job that I've taken on there, and there'll be great stories coming out of that as well. But I'll never reveal a confidence, of course, though. So, but thank you. I love writing.
Fantastic. George, if you could summarize by your research of understanding the past and understanding where we currently are as Indigenous people are dealt with within public and policies and socially, how far have we come from the past to where we are now? What would you like to say about that?
Well, we've come a long ways. I often, because I'm a former Minister of Indigenous Relations, friends and colleagues will say, you know, why are we in the situation we're in today in terms of our relationship with First Nations? And so this is a 237-page answer to that important question. Thinking about it, we have come a long ways. I'm very much honored that the Honourable Stephen Point did the foreword to my book, and Stephen, to me, often expresses things so very well. And one of the things he says in the foreword is, yeah, we've come a long ways, and it's true, but we've got a long ways to go yet. To me, we have now kind of scratched the surface in terms of reconciliation, but we've got a long ways to go, and we've got a particularly long ways to go because right from the time that Vancouver Island and mainland British Columbia were Crown colonies, right from that time through Confederation in 1871, and through 120 years after that, the province refused to participate in treaties. And so we're catching up. There was only a population of 8,000 settlers in British Columbia at Confederation. There's over 5 million now. So the challenge of finding lands, finding reconciliation packages is so much more daunting now than it was 120 years ago. We're late to the game. We've done some good things, but there's so many nations that still have not received appropriate allocation of land. All these issues continue to be big problems for us.
Indeed, and let's refer just a little bit to that forward by our incredible friend, Stephen Point. The simple truth is that when Europeans arrived in the so-called New World, they did not find an empty land, but rather a land with millions of Indigenous people who already owned and occupied their homelands. The colonial government and then the federal government set about buying the land from the Indians so the land could be made available to European settlers. That is the treaty process. There's so much to talk about within that phrase that I just mentioned, because as a journalist, I did a story called Road to Truth. I was very honored to attend with a delegation to go see the Pope for the apology in Rome. And there was about 300 of us with the media team that traveled with survivors and all of our leaders and all of our spokespersons from all the nations from across the country. And I was incredibly, incredibly moved by their stories, first of all, but to witness the history. Now, that is in 2022. The apology happened, and then now what? You know, that was a big thing. The Pope came to Canada here. I also was in Musqueam when he visited there and issued the apology there. But we have a long ways to go. And when we look at, the colonial past, in my opinion, we have a long ways to go yet. We have many things that we need to be proud of, but I really feel, and you being a former Minister of Education, is that in the books that are being taught to our children, the real history needs to be taught. And in my age, when I was going to school, I didn't learn a lot about my own history, which was very sad. But now it's coming to light. So I think with books like this, with projects that you're working on, I think that is really setting the precedent and pushing forward the truth further. And I think that, by you doing this and teaming up with Stephen Point, I think that's incredible. And I actually have a funny story to mention about Stephen Point. As I mentioned, my dad was the president of Mackenzie back in the 70s. He was president for 30 years. And they were having their AGM. It was in northern BC. So it's like a big dinner and a dance, and, you know, all the people get together and have fun. Well, my dad got word that the band that they had hired couldn't make it. The roads were bad, they couldn't travel in. And Stephen, as well as his brother Ernie, were there as guest speakers. And my dad looks at Stephen, he says, "Do you guys know how to play any instruments?" And Stephen says, "Well, I can play the guitar a little bit." And his brother Ernie says, I can do the drums a little bit." My dad says, "Perfect, we got a band." So the three of them were the band, my dad, Stephen, and Ernie. And together, they only knew 3 songs, and they played them repeatedly all night, but nobody cared. Everybody danced and had a great time. So that's my story of Stephen Point. I just want to talk about, you know, an opportunity that we should talk about is the success that Indigenous people have been able to accomplish coming from such a colonial past. As minister, tell us about some of the success stories that you've witnessed.
Oh, wow. I've seen many stories of success, and Stephen himself is just a remarkable success, having you know, lived through the era of the residential schools, having all of the you know, economic and social barriers that were put in front of him to become a very successful lawyer, judge, chief commissioner of the treaty process, all of that. And you know, it's never simple for Indigenous people in this province, or in this nation for that matter, to be successful. It's not just that we have imposed a very colonial system around reservations, and in British Columbia, particularly small reservations, but it's a very compounding and destructive policy when you build in denial. So one of the stories, and it came out of the McKenna-McBride period. There's a discussion between one of the commissioners and the Indian agent, as they were called at the time, and the agent asks, "Well, why or the commissioner asks, why are there no fishing licenses held by Indigenous people?" Answer: they're not allowed to. So the government of British Columbia had a policy all along the coast of creating very, very small reserves on the premise that fishing was the principal occupation for Indigenous people, and they didn't need larger land. They weren't farmers, they were fishermen. So on the one hand, they create these very small reserves with minimal economic opportunity associated with them, and then to turn around, the federal government turns around and takes away the opportunity of Indigenous people to hold fishing licenses. So all of these barriers are very cumulative and compounding and destructive, and to see, I mean, it's just remarkable how what an awesome arts community we have in Indigenous British Columbia. Amazing. Lots of great authors, very entrepreneurial communities. The Osoyoos First Nation is remarkable in the kind of economic development that we've seen down there. All across the province, we see in economic, social, and now political fields as well, I think, very successful Indigenous peoples and very successful businesses and so on. So it's been great to see.
Amazing. And we were actually speaking earlier about Stephen Point's daughter. She's also a minister now, Alia, with the Conservative Party for British Columbia. And I think, obviously, her dad, Stephen Point, so of course she's destined to do great things. So, and I love
Yeah.
Alia. She's an amazing lady. I want to point to this particular section in your book here. It's called Dispossession and Despair. Several thousand Indigenous Canadians served in the armed forces during the Second World War, only to return at its conclusion to a nation where they still did not possess the right to vote, except under the coercive enfranchisement provisions of the Indian Act. The irony prompted post-war reviews of Indigenous peoples' citizenship rights, and substantive reform slowly followed. My stories that I've done also with our veterans that traveled and fought for the freedom and the rights of this country were also promised land when they returned. But in fact, it was reserve lands. And it was the worst of the worst. It was like swampland. You couldn't grow anything. It was far from anything. It was very, very challenging. And also barred from even going home to visit their families upon return. I mean, how we treated our war veterans is just horrendous, and it certainly speaks truth right here in your research and in this book here. What else can we do to solve this problem of Indigenous peoples not being treated fairly in this country?
Well, that's, again, I think a really important question. So I think the treaty process is one of the important ways that we can return opportunity and choice to First Nations who have been denied those opportunities for 150 years and more. There's lots of great things that can occur with treaty. It's not only at last some land. Any white settler who came in 1871 to British Columbia would get 320 acres if they were on the interior side of the Cascade Mountains, 160 acres on this side of the Cascade Mountains. Often the First Nations reserves that were constructed both in the late colonial and early provincial period, often it might even be less than 1 acre for each a member of a band. So, I mean, vastly disproportionate allocations. So the land is one piece, and you know, it may be more difficult today than it was clearly 150 years ago, but it still needs to be done. And so there's a great example up in the north of a band that was entirely dispossessed of their land and only got a minimal allocation a little bit later on. Now through the treaty process and interim treaty arrangements, they've recently taken on a 1,700 acre ranch. So they've got some economic opportunities generated before. So it's jobs, it's resources, it's all of these things. And to me, whether opportunity is extended via the treaty process or through foundation agreement, one of the recent examples of that, Lake Babine Nation Foundation Agreement, 20,000 hectares of land around Lake Babine, and 75 million in economic development support from the federal government. So they're building, you know, a resort. They're building a forest industry. They're building opportunities for young people that simply weren't there for generations previously. So that's fabulous. It's not a treaty agreement, although Lake Babine is in the treaty process, I think stage 4. So they may get additional support later on through treaty, but it's fantastic that at last, after suffering through generations of deprivation because of provincial and federal policies, they now have that opportunity. You know, my whatever they were, great-great-great-grandparents arrived in Canada in the early 1800s. They had all the opportunity in the world. They got land, they got an opportunity to farm, they got opportunity to work, they got you know, all of the benefits of being a part of the emerging Canadian community. First Nations did not, and it's shameful that for so long they were deprived of that. And so, you know, the quicker we can move on through treaty processes and other reconciliation agreements, the better we're going to be as a nation. As long as we have a situation where people continue to be deprived of opportunity as a consequence of our colonial heritage, it's our shame, and it's our responsibility to find ways to remediate that situation.
Well, I just want to personally say thank you for the apologies that you were able to deliver as minister. That means a lot, but also action means a lot too. And certainly this current level of politics that we're in this country, we have an opportunity as citizens to not only educate ourselves, educate our children, but to vote properly and to vote the ones that are going to make that positive change. I think that really needs to be addressed. And looking at the dark colonial chapter of residential schools and the incredibly heavy impact that still remains in many of our nations across this country, so much hurt still remains. I spent a lot of time covering these stories. When the 215 was uncovered in Kamloops, I was actually on holiday, and the publicist said, "You've got to get to Kamloops tomorrow morning. We're making a huge announcement." And I'm like, "Well, I'm on holiday." She's like, "No, you better be in Kamloops in the morning at 9. So I drove that night, and that's when they announced what they discovered. And I think it really sent shockwaves around the world. It opened up eyes to the real truth of what happened out there back in that day. But spending time with the survivors, that has always stayed with me. It's been challenging as a journalist to try to not take on so much trauma of what I'm hearing. It's been a real challenge, and I think certainly reading this book, it certainly paints a picture of what we're dealing with. You know, we're still dealing with an epidemic of opioids on the streets. Since 2016, we've lost nearly 20,000 people in British Columbia. Many Indigenous people have been lost on the streets. Murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls is also a huge issue. We had the National Inquiry. Many of those recommendations are just sitting on the shelf collecting dust. Nothing has happened. What is it that we can do here collectively in this room to make that final push to really recognize the root cause of colonialism and how it affects Indigenous people?
Yeah, well, I think for me, just better understanding the story and why we face the situation we do is super important. So I grew up in the little town of Sicamous up on Shuswap Lake, and you know, one of the things as a boy, I used to always go down to what we call the Old Town, but it was actually Eagle Pass Landing back in the 1880s, and it was a stopping off point for the Columbia River goldfields. One of the products of that landing point and all the miners going through that area was that the Splatsine people were pushed off. They had lived there, I'm sure, for thousands of years, and they were summarily and brutally pushed off that land so that it could be developed as an amenity for the miners coming through. So as I grew up on our farm, which was maybe a kilometer from the bay where the steamers landed, we used to find, you know, all kinds of artifacts on the land. But to me, I didn't understand as a boy what that meant. But it was one of, I'm sure, many examples of dispossession, and the Splatsine were one of the first. But they weren't. It wasn't the last time the Splatsine suffered either. They lost a reserve as a consequence of the recommendations of McKenna McBride. So all of these things, I think, it's important for us to understand the history. And when people say to you, well, what's the matter with them? Why are they always angry? Why are they always protesting? Well, there's a very good reason for that. We destroyed the lives of their forefathers. We had an opportunity as a society 150 years ago to remediate some of that harm. We did not. British Columbia was the last jurisdiction in Canada to embrace treaty, and there's lots of British Columbians who still haven't got the slightest idea why Indigenous people should be upset. And hopefully my book's at least a small step in better understanding. And I tried to write the book in a way that it will be broadly accessible. Tried not to be an academic in it. Not that there's anything wrong with being an academic, except that their books are not sometimes easily read. I think it's important that the stories convey what we have done as a society so that we can start in more energetic, broader ways to find solutions to those many issues that you've mentioned. First Nations people are overrepresented in prisons. They're overrepresented on the tragedy of opioids, et cetera. Health outcomes are not the same as they are in non-Indigenous communities. In a whole bunch of ways, we got a lot of work to do as a society to correct things. And it starts, I think, with the land, but that's just one piece. There's a broader menu of things we need to be doing as a society to right what we've done as wrongs in the past.
Indeed, and I think that certainly starts with recognition of the first peoples of this land that have been here since time immemorial, and you've done that quite beautifully. Let me refer to Chapter 13. 4 years before the 2010 Olympics, Premier Campbell enjoyed praise from many Indigenous leaders following the completion of the New Relationship Agreement and the Kelowna Accord. For Indigenous leaders, those agreements contained future promise as well as future present benefits. Grand Chief Stuart Phillip, the firebrand leader of the Union of BC Indian Chiefs, reflected that such hopes when he spoke to the BC Liberal Annual Convention in November 2006. He praised Premier Campbell as an exceptional, extraordinary, visionary leader in this province. What is the political climate like, in your opinion, currently right now with that new relationship with Indigenous peoples?
I think it's certainly being tested right now. It's difficult to talk about how our relationship is with Indigenous people without looking at the context. To me, we're living in an extraordinarily disturbing time of our lives, largely based on what's going on to the south of us. And to have a nation that we considered to be our best friend suddenly turn on us in terms of the economic threats, all of that has, I think, governments not as centrally focused on Indigenous issues as they should be. Now, to the credit of the governments, I think both the federal and provincial governments are looking to generate partnerships with First Nations as they promote economic development. I think there's probably a little stronger push than one might like, but nevertheless, I think at least the motivation is right, and I do appreciate why they're attempting to do it, because we've been put into a pretty difficult position by President Trump. I'm sure some of you saw, I think it was yesterday morning, his address to the United Nations. I'm sure you were all relieved to hear that there's really no climate crisis, for example, that was a fabrication by the United Nations. But we, in fact, do have a climate crisis, and I think our partnership with First Nations is really important in that regard. I don't think we are going to successfully address the climate crisis without an open, honest, and full partnership with First Nations. Because First Nations, I think, have an understanding of the land that we don't in lots of ways, and I do hope that we will generate a partnership that will allow my grandchildren to grow up and live and enjoy this province just as I got to. So that's a really important thing from my perspective.
Speaking of our neighbors to the south and the climate of the political realm right now with the United States, in my opinion, with where we're at with this government, many leaders are telling me that in fact the province is railroading over rights to push through major, massive, big oil projects. They just simply are not regarding these agreements that were signed. They just okayed the floating LNG facility for the Nisga'a. I'm from the north. I'm from Northeast BC, Dawson Creek, and I know very well about LNG and fracking and the impacts that it has had on the land and all the empty LNG wells that are still sitting there abandoned. and people that are harvesting moose finding the meat green because they're licking the salt from around these fracking wells. We're getting earthquakes up there. We've never had earthquakes in northeast BC before, but now we have earthquakes. We've had, some of the tailings leaking into the drinking water for the residents around Dawson Creek, BC. There's been many, many stories of, are they really railroading over, trampling over rights to push through major projects because of the South? Is that your opinion?
Well, I don't want to be unfair to anyone in this discussion. The one thing that is really important is that before developments proceed, that there is an open and honest discussion between government, if they're a proponent of a project, and the First Nations who sometimes host these on their traditional territories. So I think it's really vital that major projects, or minor projects for that matter, be pushed through in a hurried way that doesn't give First Nations a full opportunity to ensure that it's, from an environmental perspective, it's something that they can welcome, and also from an economic perspective, that their nation will enjoy the benefits of it. It's important that they not be railroaded into that. So First Nations were remarkably entrepreneurial people when settlers began to arrive here. It was us, by a public policy of the day, stripping away all those opportunities to be entrepreneurial. So First Nations, some of them are, Soyuz is a good example, remarkably entrepreneurial in their approach to things. So yes, if they choose to embrace a development, First Nations should be obviously benefiting from it, but there needs to be time for that discussion. So I know because of the trade dispute, probably things are being pushed much harder than they should be. That's unfortunate if that's so, because First Nations should have an opportunity to be able to respond to a government initiative in a timely but comprehensive way.
And you're absolutely right. There is the other side of the coin as well, and certainly jobs are needed, training is needed, and economic development is needed. So that's a very tough issue, and I'm sorry to bring that up. It's a very political hot spot to talk about, but I appreciate you answering that. Thank you.
Yeah, well, I'm not a politician anymore. That's part of the beauty of it. For a time in my life, I had to worry about that, but at this point, I don't. The only people I can be unpopular with are my kids, and they might get me in trouble, and my grandkids now as well. So I have to be careful around them. But
you're only 28, so how did you have grandkids?
That's right. Well, I guess I must have been active during those 7 years or 4 years when I was health minister. Yeah.
George, we really appreciate you tonight. I mean, this book is groundbreaking in my opinion, and certainly the people coming forward and speaking about this book on your behalf really sets the tone for what this book is about to do in educating people. We now have time to take some questions from all of you lovely audience members here. Yes, please say your name and tell us about yourself, and please a question for George.
Thank you. My name is Ray. I'm from the Stewart Island Reserve. I understand that in the country, the comprehensive treaty process is the main aspect of government Indian policy today. And I wanted to ask, on what basis is the comprehensive treaty process legal? Because according to the United Nations,
Well, that's first of all, again, a great question. So you probably know way more about treaty relationships than I do. I don't know a lot about the treaty relationships east of the Rocky Mountains, but I know a little bit about the more recent treaties that have been done in British Columbia. So I think so we're having next spring session of the legislature, there'll be 3 treaties likely that'll be ratified by the legislature after community ratification by the Comox, Kitsilus, and Kitsum-Kalem are voting on November 1st. So the difference between those treaties that we'll see and a lot of the treaties in the past that you are rightly disparaging is that they are now, there's no cede, release, and surrender anymore. That language is no longer a part of the treaties. There is, they are living treaties in that if the First Nation decides after experience as a treaty nation for, say, a decade, that they want to do something different in childcare or in education, they have the opportunity to come back and have that changed. So there's that. And I don't believe there is any renunciation of Indian status in the treaty, the modern treaty agreements. I think they're very, the most recent treaties are very respectful of heritage, and they're quite different than the treaties that, even 20 years ago, First Nations pursued. Is that a helpful answer to your question, Ray?
Partially, but what the modern day comprehensive treaties do is nullify the Indian Act. The Indian Act legally holds your fact that you're an Indian because you were registered under the Indian Act. So in fact, they are doing away with your nationality, and with your nationality go your rights, including your right to land and self-determination, which may mean separation.
So again, a good point. So in my discussions with, for example, the Tsawwassen chief of the day when I was a minister, Kim Baird, she was quite happy to shed the Indian Act. For her, the Indian Act was a relic of colonialism, and the treaty offered her and the Tsawwassen Nation the opportunity for them to recognize themselves in their indigenous culture, their political institutions, all of those things. And I think she felt that the Indian Act was something that forced onto her nation distinctions that were blurred by the Indian Act. So I hope that's helpful in terms of what I understand to be the reason why contemporary treaties are quite different than what was forced on First Nations 20, 50, and 100 years ago.
What you never mentioned is that the people that negotiate, the people that make deals with government, the Indian politicians, are on government payroll. That is, they get their money through grants, which is government grants. So to me, they're like civil servants, and they're the ones that are dealing with government regarding my rights.
Certainly a very big topic, and unfortunately we just have a little bit of time, but we really appreciate you, Ray. You're bringing in some very valid points, and certainly maybe after you guys could talk a little further. Would that be okay?
Sure.
Yeah, great, thank you. Is there
Absolutely.
anybody else in the audience has another question? Yes.
I'll ask a question. Thank you for your presentation. I am looking forward to reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
My name is Lana, and I'm not from here. I'm from the Whitecap Dakota Nation in Saskatchewan. But my question is this. I know that Indigenous history is oral history. So how were you able to research that, to hear from the chiefs of the Nisga'a, for instance, that sort of thing? And maybe the answer is in the book, but I'd be interested to hearing that.
Oh, it's a great question. One of the very fortunate things for me was just spending an enormous amount of time in archives, that there are a considerable number of documents that, in form of letters, for example, from First Nations in the 1870s, 1880s, demanding justice. So the documents are there, and again, there are many hours spent gazing into the computer, reading the transcripts of the McKenna-McBride Commission, because there's literally thousands of hours of first-person statements by Indigenous leaders, chiefs, but also just band members who told their stories. Really quite a remarkable resource. When we get into the 20th century, then the facility of quotes from letters and newspapers and all of that. In fact, for the more recent times, you can go on and Google X, and you get all kinds of materials coming up. So that's basically how I gathered it. I have the good fortune to know people like Ed John, who's a very prominent Indigenous leader in BC, and others who I serve with in the legislature. So it's just come from a variety of sources. But hopefully that's helpful. And because I used to be a politician and be in question period, which I love, this is a surrogate question period here, we were trained not to answer questions, only to appear to answer questions. So I always have to check in with the questioner as to whether I've instinctively not answered your question. But well, thank you.
Sounds like a very good politician that I've interviewed many times indeed.
If I haven't answered your question, though, you can have a supplemental. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Lana. Anybody else out there? Yes, yeah, go to you. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh,
yeah.
Thank you. I was curious if you're able to compare the recent Haida Nation title agreements with treaty processes and, whether they're the same or if they're different, how they're different.
Yeah, they're quite different, actually. I think the great thing about the Haida agreement is it does provide the kind of recognition of Haida sovereignty that would be found through a treaty agreement, but typically not as extensive as one finds in Haida. But Haida is the only, well, I shouldn't say that, it's only because Silkatine it probably is similar based on the Supreme Court of Canada judgment on Silkatine. But Haida area is not an area where there's overlap, where there would be contested territory from other nations. So it's unique in that way. But I found it fascinating because the Haida agreement came very late in my completion of the book. But over 100 years earlier, the Haida had met with the McKenna-McBride Commission and made a point that they wanted a treaty, and that, anyways, they were dismissed by the chief commissioner, who was fairly rude and abrasive, typically with First Nations. Dismissed, the Haida appeal was dismissed, but 100 years later, the Haida made note that back in 1913, one of their forefathers had appeared at the commission and been rebuffed, and now they were at last getting the justice. So I think it's one route to justice. It's probably not going to be a common pattern, though there'll be maybe a few others, Silkatine being one. But more typically, one of the challenges we have as a commission, and the province and federal government have corresponding challenges, is sorting out the overlap issue. And I don't blame the First Nations for this. It's because governments have left this for several generations too long, and it just gets more and more complex to sort out. But we have to do it. I think it's our responsibility to do our best to sort it out. Yeah. Did I answer your question? Good. And I think there was...
yes,
yeah.
I saw another hand. Yes, go ahead, in the back there, yeah.
Thank you. I'm Daniel, first generation It was striking in the news the other day when the Premier Eby commented on the I guess BC Supreme Court ruling about Cowichan Nation lands, and his public reply was, these are profound issues that are hard to consider in the absence of the real people. The homeowners, the business owners will be affected by this decision, and clearly identifying who's real, who's not. Coming from outside, this is the party of the left that's governing. What does it mean if that's an official statement from the party of the left in this context?
Yeah, well, I certainly don't speak for Premier Eby, but I'll say this. There were a handful of occasions in my political career where words came out of my mouth, and kind of like a cartoon character, I wished that I could gather them up and put them back down into my body because they just didn't work. And I think the Premier would probably acknowledge that he might have expressed himself a little differently on that point. But again, I don't speak for him, and I'm not trying to defend him. I think the really interesting thing about the Cowichan decision, and amazingly, again, testament to my empty life, I actually read the 848-page decision, and it was fascinating to me. The experience of the Cowichan is by no means unique in the province. And again, when you read my book and do the chapters on McKenna McBride, there's literally dozens, if not over 100 examples of where an area that was perhaps a fishing camp or a hunting camp or traditional use area, it had they came back the next year and it was supplanted by a preemption that was created by the government, or a timber license for that matter, in all kinds of cases. So the interesting thing about Cowichan, and I think one of the reasons why the government was very quick to appeal it, is that in declaring title to be defective and invalid in that circumstance, there's 100 others like it across the province, and I think that's why they recoiled as quickly as they did. So we'll see. There may well be a quiet attempt to negotiate something else. I don't know, but it's a fascinating example of history coming back to bite government, and that's going to continue to happen until we go through the difficult process of reconciliation and building treaties and building agreements. It's got to be done. First Nations are not to blame for this. It's my forefathers who were not prepared to do it. And this nice lady here has been waiting patiently. Oh, good. Yeah, certainly much of what goes on in Victoria these days gives me pause. So I'll declare this first of all. When I left government in 2013, I also left partisan politics, and I've not been a party member of any party since then. Government made it easy for me by asking me to be Chief Commissioner of the BC Treaty Process and then reneging on that promise after having me on a hook for a year. It was really easy for me to say goodbye to partisan politics at that point. So, I mean, to me, as a political scientist, I was fascinated that Kevin Falcon, first of all, he changes the name from BC Liberal to BC United, and then in the midst of the 2024 campaign, decides that he's going to pull he and his colleagues out of the battle, which must have been quite distressing to his colleagues, hearing that surprise after investing their lives in that assembly. I wasn't entirely surprised at how strong the Conservative seats were. I thought that the NDP would win by a fairly comfortable majority. They did not. And in fact, the numbers are on the edge of majority-minority right now. Also fascinating, and my wonderful, awesome editor up here, Nadine, she came to my rescue when I said to British Books, UBC Press, oh, this MLA Dallas Brody has made the most outrageous remarks about, what did you call it, the billion-dollar reconciliation industry, disparaging lawyers, chiefs, all of the folks involved in reconciliation. I wanted to get that quote in because it was very reminiscent of what a special joint committee of the House of Commons and the Senate said in 1927. And it was very reminiscent of what people like Joseph Trutch and John Robson and Frank Barnard were saying back in the 1870s. And so it was a kind of a thematic tying together of that. So, I mean, it was appalling what she said, but in terms of a piece that kind of tied a whole bunch of stuff together right at the end of the book, it was, well, I hope you don't regret going to bat for me, Nadine. No, she didn't. I'm not sure I've answered your question, though. I have? Really? That's uncharacteristic of question period. And I think
we have room for one
Yeah,
more quick
please.
one. One more quick one. Yeah, Jorge has approved it. One more, please. Anybody else out there has one more question? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, go ahead again. Yeah. Yeah.
You had talked earlier about the foundation agreements. I wonder if you can tell us what those are and if they're part of the treaty process or separate.
Sure, glad to. They are separate from the treaty process, although the one foundation agreement that has been successfully concluded, the nation involved, the Lake Babine Nation, is in the treaty process at, I think it's stage 4. So they're about 2/3 of the way through treaty process. But for reasons that I don't fully understand, but nevertheless, I think the agreement's great. The Lake Babine Nation engaged with the province to, so typical of the small reserve policy of colonial and early provincial governments, even up in Lake Babine, which is not downtown Vancouver, it's well out into rural British Columbia. Even there, the province would only provide reserves of just over 1 hectare per band member. Again, in comparison to 320 acres for settlers. So they had very, very limited economic opportunity as a consequence of the minimal reserve that was provided. So with the foundation agreement, the negotiation was, I think, for 22,000 hectares of additional lands, much of that on Lake Babine and other lakes, so they've got opportunity for resorts and fishing enterprises, for forestry, for all of that. So, and the federal government was engaged and have provided $75 million towards economic development. in that area. So it's got many of the characteristics of a treaty, but is not a treaty. Now, they may come back to the treaty table and hope for, you know, additional lands or maybe additional resources. That'll be their choice. But that's the story on foundation agreements. You know, some around treaty world don't particularly like foundation agreements. From my perspective, and it's a simplistic perspective, but my perspective is any agreement that confers opportunities and choices on Indigenous people who've been too long denied those opportunities and choices, I'm going to support it. No, you know, that's the way it goes. Before we go, I wanted to thank Jorge for hosting us tonight. This is an interesting story, and you could tell your grandchildren about this years from now. When Jorge goes home to Mexico City, did I get that right? Yes. Yes. His family calls him George. And when I go home to my children are all adults. I've got grandchildren, but they all call me Jorge. It's just one of those wild cultural stories that will live on forever.
I think you're twinning right now. I just want to say, George, congratulations on this incredible
Thank
book.
you.
UBC Press, everybody that came tonight, thank you so much for joining us this evening for this very intellectual and very important discussion and shedding the light on such important history, George. We can't thank you enough.
Oh,
Congratulations,
well,
my friend. Thank you so much. Round of applause, Mr. George Abbott. Thank you guys for coming. And please go buy a book so this gentleman here can sign it for you. Thank you for coming, everybody.
Be my pleasure.
Again.
Thanks so much for coming out.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Tina, for a great interview.
Thank you.
Thank
My
you.
honor. Thank you.